So, welcome to episode 80 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time we're going to talk about Grachan Moncur III's 1963 classic release and his debut release, Evolution, which came out on Blue Note. And this is actually one of the more recent Blue Note reissues. Blue Note, as I've mentioned on some other reviews, has a fantastic series of reissues. The quality is extremely high and well worth picking up. This, I think, would be most fairly characterized as avant-garde. The avant-garde, of course, was a more general movement in the 20th century, away from classical forms and traditional structures of art, composition. And in jazz, it meant a departure from traditional expectations regarding keys, scales, chord changes, and so on. But unlike free jazz, heavily structured, it was composed in advance, pre-identification of the keys and the changes that were going to be used, and importantly, there was still a major distinction between soloists and the accompaniment. And that contrasts with what you might call a true free jazz, like you would find in some of Ornette Coleman's work with his double quartet, or like you find with Archie Shepp's improvisational work. So the music on here is still quite recognizable to people who listen to a lot of post-war jazz, bebop, post-bop, hard bop, and so on, but it has far fewer assumptions about what's required in a composition. This is Moncur's debut as a leader. He writes all the tracks. The personnel, of course, include Moncur on trombone, one of the few high-profile jazz trombonists, Jackie McLean on alto sax, and Bobby Hutcherson on vibes. The three of them are a tight unit, actually, and more on that later, about the relationship between those players. Lee Morgan, wonderful trumpeter, Bob Cranshaw on bass, and Tony Williams on drums. Pretty much all these folks, with the exception of Cranshaw, who recorded as a sideman for Sonny Rollins on countless albums, but also all kinds of other great records through the 1960s. But the other five players all recorded as leaders for Blue Note, and so this is really kind of an all-star lineup on this record, and unsurprisingly, the playing is excellent. So Moncur is born in New York. He is exposed to music from a very early age. His dad was a musician, played with Billie Holiday, lots of other people. Through his dad, he knew people like Art Blakey, he knew Dizzy Gillespie, he knew Red Fox, all kinds of well-known entertainers in the 1940s and 1950s. His mother ran a beauty salon which catered to an equally large number of well-known people, including Dinah Washington. So Moncur has, I guess, what you might call a fair amount of privilege musically growing up, and therefore has doors open for him in terms of gigs and connections that other people might not necessarily have had. He starts playing the cello at age 6, but that doesn't really stick. His dad then gives him a trombone at age 9, and that does work out. He goes to a private high school for music lessons, starts to gig after high school. He plays with the Jazz Tet, with Benny Golson and Art Farmer. He plays with Ray Charles. Plays with Sonny Rollins, and he plays here and there with Jackie McLean, and he forms a real bond with Jackie McLean. He ends up playing on Jackie McLean's first Blue Note albums, One Step Beyond and Destination Out, which are absolute classics. And he also contributes most of the composition to those albums as well. All three of these albums are recorded between April 1963 and November 1963, and so they're best viewed as kind of a piece. The musical styles, because of course Moncur is doing much of the composition, are very similar, and McLean, Hutcherson, and Moncur are on all these records. The other personnel vary a little bit, but it's essentially McLean, Hutcherson, and Moncur who are the core of this band, effectively, at this time. I talked about the avant-garde, and this album is really actually quite accessible. It sounds, frankly, quite tame to contemporary ears, but at the time, jazz was moving in lots of different directions, and record labels were concerned about their sales. He records a follow-up album called Some Other Stuff on Blue Note a year later, recorded in the absence of Alfred Lion, who is the label's head. And when Lion finds out that the second album has been recorded, he loses it because he thinks it's absolutely crazy, the music's too far out there. He's made even madder by the fact that Moncur has his own publishing company, and so Lion doesn't actually have the publishing rights either. So Moncur gets dropped from the label. Mistake, I think, for Blue Note, and a sad development in Moncur's career. But he goes on to play with Archie Shepp. Moncur himself was not that political a guy, but Archie Shepp was, of course. And they go with Jimmy Garrison and Beaver Harris and Roswell Rudd form a band, and they go on a tour of Europe in a big kind of review, which includes Thelonious Monk, and includes Sarah Vaughan, and a whole bunch of people. Miles Davis is essentially heading up this tour, but Shep's music and the sort of radical Pan-Africanism that he was into, and the receptivity of European audiences to radical statements from Black Americans about politics, meant that their music was consumed voraciously, and they would play extended sets and get huge ovations, really pissing off Davis. Anyway, he ends up staying in France. He records a couple of pretty good albums with BYG, writes another album or two in the 1970s, one for the Jazz Composers Orchestra in 1974, and then his health kind of falls apart, and he records really only sporadically for the rest of his career. So there are only 4 tracks in this album, all of course written by Moncur. The first is called Air Raid. The initial solo played by Moncur has this fantastic kind of airplane diving sound, which he manages to pull out of his trombone. And McLean then comes in also playing fantastically bended notes. And then you've got Lee Morgan, then you've got Hutcherson with this incredible, sort of brief but really just liberated solo. Probably the most out there passage on the whole record. And then Tony Williams with a bit of a drum solo, just showing how much talent there was in this date. The second song on side 1 is the title track, Evolution. It starts off in kind of a ponderous way. It's got only whole notes in the basic figure, but then you get this totally ripping solo from McLean. One of, I think, his best moments on any record, whether he's a leader or whether in this case he's a sideman. And again, between McLean and Hutcherson and Moncur, who's a sideman and who's a leader in these 3 albums is kind of moot. Then you get this wonderful kind of stuttering solo from Lee Morgan. It's such a great piece of music. It's a bit like a repetitive drone with Hutcherson and Tony Williams occasionally punctuating it. I sort of feel like this music, it's so fitting for the times. This feeling of Cold War dread, if that makes any sense. Anyway, so much for existential angst and Cold War dread. In side 2, we're on to The Coaster, which is a much more upbeat, frankly cheerful song compared to what's gone on side 1, but there is still a little bit of a minor key undercurrent, I think. A Moncur solo kicks it off. Then you've got McLean with some wonderful playing. Lee Morgan's solo here, I think, is really interesting. It has a kind of a Spanish feel to it almost. Then Hutcherson comes in on vibes, and I have to say, the vibes, to me, throughout this whole album, contribute so much to the sound. Much as in the way that horror movie directors often use, children's music boxes to kind of set some sort of ironic counterpoint in quite a chilling way. And Williams and Cranshaw, whom I haven't mentioned yet, really just totally shine throughout. The final track is Monk in Wonderland. Now, of course, as the name suggests, Moncur wrote this for Thelonious Monk, and Thelonious Monk loved this tune. And I had mentioned how Blue Note had dropped Moncur after the follow-up album to this. So after Moncur had made some other stuff, his second album with Blue Note, he was chatting with Monk, who had contacted him about this song and just loved it. And he was also talking to Art Blakey and with Woody Shaw, and was hatching plans for an album. These folks had all agreed, but Alfred Lion said, absolutely no, this is taking your music too far in some other direction. What can you say about a decision like that? I guess he was a businessman, but so unfortunate that album was never made. This song swings a lot harder, I think, than the other songs in the album. Still got that sort of uneasy selection of accompanying chords with that unsettling impression, and Hutcherson again with that spooky vibe. Everybody chips in with solos, and then we're back to the opening theme of the song, which is kind of a sort of a weirdly rollicking, almost circusy kind of a theme. But it works, and it's a great ending to the album, which itself, front to back, is just phenomenal. Well, I think I like side 1 the best, notwithstanding Thelonious Monk's judgment on a song named after him. It's got a real sense of zeitgeist about it. It is approachable and accessible to traditional hard bop fans, but there's enough here which is experimental and exciting to keep anybody who likes the avant-garde and free jazz entertained, I think, for the whole album. I think it's got 2 brilliant tracks on side 1 and 2 pretty good tracks on side 2, and for me this is a 4.5 out of 5 star album.